If farting were a crime, my older brother Paul would be guilty of unspeakable atrocities. I don't understand why, but if I were to spit on you, I could be charged with assault and go to jail for months. But for some reason, it's perfectly legal if I fart in my hands and throw it at you. And my brother Paul ruthlessly exploited this legal loophole. Sometimes he would fart under a blanket, and then when I would walk by, he would unleash it. And he would call that a brown-eyed baker. And sometimes he'd make a lot of faces and really overact as he farted, and he called that a William Shatner. And many times in public, right before he would fart, he'd yell out, "Here's a Ukrainian chestnut." And, he did that in front of a young lady I just started dating, and she didn't run away, so I married that woman. And we settled up here while Paul stayed back in our hometown of Cornelius, North Carolina. But then 3.5 years ago, Paul had a heart attack. He didn't die, but he came pretty close. He only had 10% heart function, so they couldn't do a bypass surgery. And the doctors only gave him a couple of weeks, maybe a month, if he didn't get a heart transplant. And at first I was like, hey, no big deal. You know, Paul's a young guy. And don't forget, this was a couple years ago. They'd just given Dick Cheney a heart, and he was really old and totally evil. But Paul didn't have health insurance, so they just gave him some pills and told him to get his affairs in order. But Paul never complained. He was always the same lovable goof, making fart jokes. So I started driving down every weekend, and every weekend I would make the same 6-hour drive. I'd leave work at Friday at 5 o'clock, and I'd get home on Sunday night. And it was tough, you know, because I have a life up here with a job and a wife and a cat. And after 4 months, I talked to my mom, and I was like, you know, we got to work something else out. So I decided I would start coming down every other weekend. But for the 2 weeks while I was away, I started getting overwhelmed with this fear that Paul would die before I would drive back down. And every time I would get to his apartment, I kind of exhaled before I turned the doorknob because I was afraid I'd find him dead. And that's what scared me more than anything, was that Paul would die alone. And it drove me nuts, you know, all the way driving down there and all the way back. And, you know, I don't know when it started, but I started playing this game in my head. It was exactly 394 miles from my front door to his apartment. And if I averaged 65 miles per hour, then it would take almost exactly 6 hours to get there. And so I made a deal with myself that if I could average 65 miles per hour on the way down, Paul wouldn't be dead when I got there. And if I could average 65 miles on the way back, then Paul wouldn't die before the next time I came down. So that way I could just forget about it for a couple weeks. And I know it sounds silly, but it worked, you know. I kept driving down there. He kept not dying. So, you know, why mess with success? And it's tough to average 65 miles per hour on a drive that long. You know, you got to get gas, and there's construction and speed traps. And I never listened to the radio, just 6 hours of silence while I constantly calculated how fast I'd gone in the last hour, or 30 minutes, or 15 minutes. And it drove me crazy when my wife would come along because she had no idea what was going on inside my head, but she was always in my ear about how fast I was going. And she has the bladder of a hamster. She has to constantly go to the bathroom, and she didn't understand why I got so upset if she wanted to go to the bathroom more than once. And this goes on for 2 years, you know, 36 hours with Paul, 12 hours driving. 2 weeks later, 36 hours with Paul, 12 hours driving. So then Paul's legs started swelling up, so he went to the hospital, and I drove down. And the doctors were all real positive, and then they told him, you're going to go home tomorrow. And so I looked at my watch, I realized, hey, if I leave right now, I can make it back in time to go to work. So I asked Paul, you know, do you want me to hang out? And I said, yeah, actually, you know, I don't really like hospitals. It'd be kind of cool if you stayed. I thought about it, but then, but someone went off in the back of my head, you know? I mean, it was Sunday night, and it felt like bad luck if I stayed because it would mess up the whole 65 mile per hour thing I'd going. So I was like, I should go. And he said, okay. And then he got real serious. He'd had a real rough day at the hospital, and he said, come here, there's something I really want to tell you. And he couldn't get comfortable, all day, but he had this big smile on his face. So I leaned in, and he pressed his lips to my ear, and he held on to me as tight as he could. And then he farted. He farted all over me. So I drove home and averaged 65 miles per hour, no problem, all the way back. The next day, I go to work, and then around lunch, I get a call from my stepfather. And he calls and he says, something's happened at the hospital, and Paul's crashing, and they're transporting him to hospice care, and, this is it. And then he tells me that it's all too much for my mom, and she's at home. And then he says that Paul's all alone. And I averaged 87 miles per hour on the way down. But when I got there, the nurses had shot Paul up with so much morphine. He was out of it. And I don't know if he knew I was there. I don't think he did. But they told me I should talk to him. And so that's what I did for 12 hours straight. And then the next morning, one of his friends showed up. And we sat there with him until he started struggling. And then a nurse came in and said, I'm sorry, your brother's gone. And at that moment, for the first time in my life, I'd never felt alone like that before. But also, at that exact, precise moment, Paul ripped the most massive fart I have ever heard. It was like a rich, oily miasma that covered the room and seared your nostrils. And the nurses coming in had to fight it off. But it was like quicksand. The more you fought, the worse it got. And it smelled like eggs and hot dogs and Fresca, oddly. It was his magnum opus. It was the most beautiful, poetic, perfectly timed things I will ever experience. I still make that same drive down every now and again to visit my mom, and now my wife can go to the bathroom as many times as she likes. But sometimes on the drive, my mind will drift, and I'll pass some landmark, like an exit sign or a mile marker, and I'll get this flash, like I'm going to be late. So I speed up. And when that happens, I'm getting much better at letting go of the gas pedal. Thank you.